Elena had worked in the copper mines of Blackrock for 12 years, following in her father's footsteps just like everyone else in town. Every morning at 5:30, she would kiss her sleeping daughter goodbye and drive through the mountain roads to the mine entrance. The town depended on this place completely. Without the mine, Blackrock would become another ghost town scattered across Montana. As a safety inspector, Elena knew these tunnels better than anyone. She had walked every corridor, checked every support beam, and documented thousands of minor issues over the years. But what she discovered in Tunnel 7 on that cold Tuesday morning was different. These weren't small problems that could wait for the next maintenance cycle. These were cracks that made her stomach drop. The concrete walls showed stress fractures running in zigzag patterns from floor to ceiling. Support beams had shifted, creating gaps where there should be solid connections. Elena had seen enough mine collapses in training videos to know what this meant. Tunnel 7 was ready to come down, and when it did, anyone working inside would be buried alive. She took pictures with her inspection camera and filled out the emergency report forms. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote the words, "Immediate. Closure recommended." This wasn't just paperwork. This was the difference between 23 families having fathers come home for dinner or never seeing them again. Elena drove straight to the main office, where Frank Morrison sat behind his desk, coffee stain on his shirt and calculator in his hand. Frank had been mine supervisor for 8 years, and he never liked bad news. Elena placed the report in front of him and watched his face change as he read. "You sure about this, Elena?" Frank asked, not looking up from the papers. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied. Frank leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. "You know what this means, right? We shut down Tunnel 7. We lose 30% of our daily output. Corporate already cut our budget twice this year. They're not going to be happy about losing more money." Elena felt her heart racing. "Frank, if that tunnel comes down—" I know, Frank interrupted, waving his hand. "But look at it from my position. I send this report up the chain, and they're going to want to know why I let it get this bad. They're going to want someone to blame." That afternoon, Elena walked through the town's main street, past the small grocery store, the post office, and the diner where miners gathered after their shifts. Everyone here had family working underground. The Hernandez family had 3 sons in the mines. Old Pete Williams had worked Tunnel 7 for 15 years. Maria Santos cleaned the mine offices to support her husband Carlos and their 2 children. These people trusted Elena to keep their loved ones safe. They relied on her inspections and her reports. But what good was trust if the people above her wouldn't listen? Elena's father, Mikhail, sat on his front porch every evening, oxygen tank beside his chair. Years of breathing mine dust had destroyed his lungs, but he still loved talking about the old days when unions protected workers and supervisors cared more about safety than schedules. "Papa," Elena said that night, sitting beside him on the porch swing, "what would you do if you knew something terrible was going to happen but nobody wanted to hear about it?" Mikhail coughed for a long moment before answering. "In my time, we had different problems. But I learned one thing. The mind doesn't care about your fears. It only cares about respect. You respect the mountain, or it will crush you." Elena understood what he meant, but respecting the mountain meant more than following safety rules. It meant speaking truth, even when truth was inconvenient. The next morning, Frank called Elena into his office again. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 men in expensive suits sat across from his desk, representatives from Titan Mining Corporation's regional office. "Elena, these gentlemen have some concerns about your report," Frank said, his voice sounding strained. The older man with gray hair spoke first. "Miss Kovac, we appreciate your attention to safety. However, our engineering team reviewed your photographs remotely, and they believe you may have misinterpreted what you saw. Sometimes, what looks serious to an untrained eye is actually normal." Settling. Elena felt heat rise in her face. I've been inspecting mines for 12 years. I know the difference between settling and structural failure. The second man, younger with a tablet in his hands, smiled coldly. Of course, your experience is valuable, but our engineers have advanced degrees and computer modeling software. They're recommending additional monitoring instead of closure. We can install some sensors and check the tunnel weekly. Weekly? Elena's voice came out louder than she intended. Those cracks are growing every day. By next week, it might be too late. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Elena, corporate has made their decision. We're going to increase monitoring and reduce the crew size in Tunnel 7 as a precaution. Elena looked around the room at three men who had never crawled through a dangerous tunnel or felt the mountain shake during blasting. They were making decisions about other people's lives from behind desks and computer screens. What if you're wrong? Elena asked quietly. The older man packed his papers into his briefcase. Miss Kovac, if you can't support company decisions, perhaps you'd be happier working somewhere else. There are other mines, other towns. Elena walked home that day feeling like she carried a mountain on her shoulders. Her daughter Sophie was doing homework at the kitchen table when Elena arrived. Mom, you look sad, Sophie said, looking up from her math problems. Elena sat down beside her daughter and helped her solve equations for a few minutes. Math was simple. 2 plus 2 always equaled 4. In math, there were right answers and wrong answers, and everyone could agree on which was which. Sophie, Elena said finally, what would you do if you knew something important, but nobody wanted to listen? Sophie thought for a moment, pencil tapping against her notebook. I guess I'd have to decide if it was important enough to keep trying, even if people got angry at me. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the families in town, about the men who would walk into Tunnel 7 tomorrow morning, about the mountain waiting above their heads. She thought about her father's words about respecting the mountain and her daughter's simple wisdom about doing what was right even when it was hard. Elena had spent her whole life in Black Rock. She had friends here, family here, a life built around this community. But she also had 23 men counting on her to keep them safe, even if they didn't know it. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any mountain. 3 weeks passed since Elena's meeting with the corporate men. Every morning she watched 23 miners walk into Tunnel 7, and every evening she held her breath until they all came out safely. The monitoring sensors had been installed, but Elena knew they were just expensive decorations. Sensors couldn't hold up a mountain. The cracks in the tunnel walls grew longer each day. Elena measured them secretly during her rounds, marking the changes in a small notebook she kept hidden in her toolbox. What started as hairline fractures were now gaps wide enough to fit her fingers inside. The mountain was speaking, but nobody wanted to listen. On Wednesday night, Elena's phone rang at 2 in the morning. The caller ID showed the mine's emergency number. Her heart stopped for a moment before she answered. Elena, we need you down here right away, came Frank's voice, tight with panic. There's been an incident in Tunnel 7. Elena threw on her clothes and drove through empty streets toward the mine. Emergency vehicles filled the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the darkness in urgent colors. She had seen this, seen in nightmares, but now it was real. Carlos Mendoza and his nephew Diego had been working the late shift, checking equipment in the deepest part of Tunnel 7. At 11:45, a section of the ceiling came down without warning. 20 tons of rock and concrete trapped both men in a space smaller than Elena's kitchen. Elena joined the rescue team as they worked to reach the trapped miners. The sound of drilling echoed through the tunnels while everyone prayed the rest of the ceiling would hold. Frank paced back and forth, radio in his hand, updating corporate headquarters every few minutes. How bad is it? Elena asked the rescue coordinator. Bad enough, he replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. The good news is they're alive and conscious. The bad news is Carlos is hurt pretty seriously. We can hear Diego talking, but Carlos isn't responding much. 6 hours. That's how long it took to cut through enough rock to pull both men to safety. Elena watched as paramedics loaded Carlos onto a stretcher, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Diego walked out on his own, covered in dust and blood from small cuts, but his eyes held the blank stare of someone who had looked death in the face. At the hospital, Maria Santos sat in the waiting room, rosary beads in her hands and tears streaming down her face. Her 2 children slept in uncomfortable plastic chairs, while she waited for news about her husband's surgery. The doctor says Carlos has internal bleeding, Maria whispered to Elena. They don't know how bad it is yet. Elena sat beside Maria, feeling the weight of guilt pressing down on her chest. She had known this would happen. She had written the reports, taken the pictures, documented everything. But it hadn't been enough to protect Carlos and Diego. The next morning, Frank called all the safety inspectors to a meeting. The company's story was already prepared. The incident report would list equipment malfunction as the cause. A faulty support bolt had allegedly failed, causing a localized collapse that couldn't have been predicted or prevented. Elena read the draft report and felt sick to her stomach. Every word was carefully chosen to avoid blame and minimize responsibility. There was no mention of the structural cracks, no reference to Elena's warnings, no acknowledgement that this accident could have been prevented. "I can't sign this," Elena said, pushing the papers back across the table. Frank looked around the room at the other inspectors, all of whom had already signed their copies. "Elena, everyone agrees this was an unforeseeable accident. Sometimes these things just happen in mining." "These things don't just happen," Elena replied. "I documented structural problems 3 weeks ago. I recommended immediate closure. This accident happened exactly where I said it would happen." One of the other inspectors, Pete Williams, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Pete had worked these mines for 20 years, and his own son was part of the Tunnel 7 crew. "Elena, maybe you should think about this more carefully. If you make trouble now, they might close the whole operation. Then nobody has jobs." Elena looked around the table at men she had worked with for years. They all knew she was right, but they also knew the price of being right. Their families needed these paychecks. Their mortgages and car payments and children's college funds depended on staying quiet and going along with the official story. That afternoon, Elena visited Carlos in the hospital. He was awake but groggy from pain medication. Maria sat beside his bed, holding his hand and trying to smile when he looked at her. "Elena," Carlos said weakly, "what really happened down there? Frank came by earlier with some story about equipment failure, but that didn't feel right." Elena looked at Maria, then back at Carlos. These people trusted her. They had always trusted her to tell them the truth, even when the truth was hard to hear. "The tunnel wasn't safe, Carlos. I tried to get it closed weeks ago, but corporate wouldn't listen. What happened to you and Diego? It shouldn't have happened." Maria squeezed her husband's hand tighter. "Can you do something about it? Can you make them fix the problems before someone else gets hurt?" Elena didn't know how to answer. She had already tried the proper channels. She had followed procedures, filled out forms, attended meetings. The system was designed to protect the company, not the workers. "I don't know," Elena said honestly, "but I'm going to try." That evening, Elena sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and her phone beside her. She had spent hours researching federal safety agencies, labor organizations, and investigative reporters. Somewhere out there, someone had to care about the truth. Sophie walked into the kitchen and saw her mother surrounded by papers and websites about mine safety violations. "Mom, are you in trouble?" Sophie asked. Elena looked at her daughter and realized that staying silent wasn't protecting her family. It was teaching Sophie that injustice had to be accepted, that powerful people could hurt others without consequences. "No, sweetheart," Elena said, pulling Sophie close. "But some other people might be in trouble if I don't do something to help them." Elena opened a new document on her computer and began typing. She wrote about the cracks in Tunnel 7, about her, reports that were ignored, about Carlos lying in a hospital bed because corporate profits mattered more than worker safety. She included photographs, measurements, and dates. Everything she had documented over the past 3 weeks. When she finished, Elena had a detailed report that told the complete truth about what happened. She didn't know if anyone would listen, but she knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. Carlos and Diego had nearly died because she hadn't pushed hard enough the first time. Elena attached the report to emails addressed to federal mine safety officials, investigative journalists, and worker advocacy groups. Her finger hovered over the send button for a long moment. She thought about her job, her house, her life in Black Rock. She thought about Frank's threats and corporate lawyers. She thought about being blacklisted from mining work and having to start over somewhere else. Then she thought about Maria sitting in that hospital waiting room, praying for her husband's life. Elena clicked send. Elena's emails sat in her sent folder like small bombs waiting to explode. She had sent her detailed report to 12 different people and organizations, but for 3 days, nothing happened. No phone calls, no replies, nothing but silence that made her wonder if anyone cared about the truth. On Friday morning, her phone finally rang. The caller introduced himself as David Chen, an investigative reporter from the Denver Tribune. His voice was cautious but interested. "Miss Kovac, I received your report about the mining accident. The documentation you provided is quite detailed. Are you willing to go on the record with this information?" Elena's heart pounded. Going on the record meant no turning back. It meant her name would be attached to accusations against one of the largest mining companies in the region. "Yes," she said simply. "Everything I wrote is true." David Chen spent 2 hours on the phone with Elena, asking questions about the timeline, the corporate response, and the injured miners. He seemed genuinely concerned about worker safety, but Elena could hear the hesitation in his voice when she mentioned Titan Mining Corporation. "I need to be honest with you," David said finally. "Titan has a team of lawyers who specialize in shutting down negative coverage. They've sued newspapers before for publishing stories about their safety record. My editor will need to see very strong evidence before we can move forward." Elena provided everything she had: photographs, inspection reports, medical records from the hospital, even testimony from Diego about what he experienced during the collapse. But 3 days later, David called back with disappointing news. "Elena, I'm sorry. My editor killed the story. Titan's legal team contacted our publisher directly and threatened a defamation lawsuit that could cost us millions. Without additional sources willing to go on record, we can't run the piece." Elena felt her last hope slipping away. The traditional channels, corporate management, federal agencies, mainstream media, all seemed blocked by Titan's money and influence. She sat in her kitchen that night, staring at her laptop screen, wondering what else she could do. Sophie was working on a school project about social media and how young people use technology to organize and share information. Elena watched her daughter effortlessly navigate between different platforms, creating posts and sharing content with her friends. "Mom, why don't you put your story online yourself?" Sophie suggested. "My teacher says regular people can reach thousands of other people now without needing newspapers or TV stations." Elena had never been comfortable with social media. She had basic accounts but rarely posted anything. The idea of sharing her story with strangers on the internet felt overwhelming and scary. But what choice did she have? Elena spent the weekend learning how to create posts that people might actually read. She wrote her story in simple language, focusing on Carlos and Diego's accident and the safety problems that caused it. She included some of her photographs showing the cracks in the tunnel walls, though she was careful not to show anything that might identify specific workers. Corporate executives in expensive suits decided that fixing dangerous cracks wasn't worth the cost, Elena wrote. 2 good men nearly died because profit margins mattered more than human lives. How many more accidents will happen before someone listens? Elena posted her story on Monday morning and then went to work, trying to act normal while her stomach churned with anxiety. By lunchtime, her post had been shared 12 times, mostly by friends and family members from BlackRock. But that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Ana Rodriguez, Carlos's 18-year-old daughter who was studying environmental science at the state university, found Elena's post. Ana had been furious about her father's accident and the company's obvious lies about what caused it. Ana shared Elena's story with her college environmental club, along with her own passionate commentary about corporate responsibility and worker safety. The college students shared it with other environmental and social justice groups. By evening, Elena's post had been shared over 300 times. Dr. Rebecca Kim, a professor of occupational safety at Columbia University, saw the post through her network of environmental researchers. She had studied mining accidents for 15 years and immediately recognized the significance of Elena's documentation. Dr. Kim called Elena that night. "Miss Kovac, I've reviewed your photographs and measurements. What you've documented is extremely serious. Would you be willing to work with me on an independent safety assessment?" Elena felt tears of relief running down her face. Finally, someone with credentials and expertise was taking her concerns seriously. "Yes," Elena said. "Whatever it takes." But Titan Mining Corporation wasn't going to wait quietly while Elena and Dr. Kim built their case. On Tuesday morning, Elena arrived at work to find Frank Morrison waiting in her office with 2 security guards and a termination letter. "Elena, effective immediately, your employment with Titan Mining is terminated for violation of confidentiality. Agreements and insubordination," Frank read from a prepared statement. "You have 30 minutes to clean out your personal belongings." Elena's co-workers watched silently as she packed her few personal items into a cardboard box. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked away entirely. Pete Williams, whose son still worked in the dangerous tunnels, walked past without making eye contact. As Elena carried her box to her car, she noticed Frank posting a notice on the employee bulletin board. The notice warned that any employee caught sharing proprietary company information or making false statements about company operations would face immediate termination and potential legal action. That afternoon, Elena received a certified letter from Titan's legal team. The company was suing her for theft of proprietary information, violation of employment contracts, and defamation. They demanded that she remove her social media posts and cease all communication with journalists or researchers. Elena read the legal threats twice, feeling the weight of expensive lawyers and corporate power pressing down on her. But she also thought about Carlos, still recovering from surgery, and the 23 miners who walked into Tunnel 7 every day without knowing how dangerous it really was. Elena called Dr. Kim and explained the situation. The professor was quiet for a long moment. "Elena, I understand if you need to step back from this. These legal threats are designed to scare people into silence." "Dr. Kim," Elena replied, 3 weeks ago I was too scared to push harder when corporate ignored my safety report. Carlos almost died because I didn't fight hard enough. I'm not making that mistake again." That evening, Elena updated her social media post with news about her termination and the legal threats. She wrote about the choice between temporary security and permanent safety, between protecting herself and protecting her co-workers. "They can fire me and sue me," Elena wrote, "but they can't make me pretend that dangerous working conditions are acceptable. Some things matter more than keeping quiet." The response surprised everyone, including Elena. Her post about being fired for speaking truth about safety violations was shared over 2,000 times in 24 hours. Comments poured in from miners, factory workers, nurses, and other people who had faced similar situations where they had to choose between job security and doing what was right. Elena realized she wasn't alone anymore. Her first step forward had created ripples that were spreading far beyond BlackRock, reaching people who understood exactly what she was going through. 3 other miners from Tunnel 7 contacted Elena privately that week. They had been documenting safety problems too, taking pictures and keeping notes, but had been too afraid to speak up. "After seeing what happened to you," one of them said, "we realized that staying quiet isn't protecting us. It's just making things worse." Elena's first step forward had become an invitation for others to step forward too. Elena's story had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. What started as a desperate post on social media was now being discussed in university classrooms, union halls, and government offices across the country. Dr. Kim had presented their safety findings at a major conference, and the video of her presentation was watched by over 50,000 people in the first week. But fame came with a price. Elena's unemployment benefits had been denied because Titan claimed she was fired for cause. Her savings account was shrinking, while legal bills piled up on her kitchen table. Some nights, she lay awake wondering if she had made a terrible mistake that would destroy her family's future. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning. Linda Torres, a staff attorney with the Workers' Justice Coalition, had seen Dr. Kim's presentation and Elena's story. "Ms. Kovac, my organization specializes in protecting workers who speak out about dangerous conditions. We'd like to represent you free of charge against Titan's legal attacks." Elena felt like she could breathe for the first time in weeks. "Are you sure? Titan has a lot of expensive lawyers." Linda laughed. "So do we. And we've been waiting for a case exactly like this one. Your documentation is extraordinary, and your courage is inspiring people everywhere." While Elena gained legal support, her story was reaching places she never expected. David Chen, the reporter whose newspaper had initially killed the story, called her with surprising news. "Elena, my editor has changed his mind. After seeing the public response to your social media posts and Dr. Kim's research, he wants to run a full investigation. The publisher decided that hiding from Titan's threats would damage our credibility more than facing their lawsuits." David's investigation revealed something shocking. Titan mining had safety violations at 12 different locations across 6 states. Over the past 5 years, 37 workers had died in accidents that federal investigators later determined could have been prevented with proper safety measures. The expose ran on the front page of the Denver Tribune with the headline, "Death in the Mines, How Corporate Profits Override Worker Safety." Elena's story was featured prominently, but she was no longer alone. The article included interviews with families of dead miners, former safety inspectors who had been fired for speaking up, and federal officials who admitted they lacked resources to properly monitor mining companies. In Black Rock, the newspaper story created a firestorm. Some residents blamed Elena for bringing negative attention to their town and threatening the mine that provided most local jobs. Others quietly thanked her for finally speaking truths that everyone knew, but nobody had dared to say. The breaking point came at the monthly town hall meeting. Mayor Patricia Chen had scheduled the meeting to discuss recent negative publicity and protecting our community's economic interests. She expected to face a few dozen residents in the small community center. Instead, over 200 people packed the building. Families of current miners sat next to families of workers who had been injured or killed in previous accidents. Reporters from 3 different newspapers took notes, while television cameras recorded everything. Carlos Mendoza attended the meeting in a wheelchair, still recovering from his injuries. When Mayor Chen opened the floor for comments, Carlos slowly made his way to the microphone. 6 weeks ago, I almost died in Tunnel 7, Carlos said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. My wife thought she was going to become a widow. My children thought they were going to lose their father, not because of bad luck or an act of God, but because people in expensive suits decided that fixing dangerous cracks wasn't worth the cost. Carlos turned to look directly at the corporate representatives who had come to defend the company. Elena, Kovac tried to save my life by reporting those dangerous conditions. Instead of listening to her, you fired her and threatened to sue her. What does that say about how much you value the lives of your workers? Maria Santos stood up from her seat in the audience. She had never spoken publicly before, but watching her husband struggle with his injuries had given her a fierce courage. "I clean the mine offices," Maria said. "I see the reports that get filed and the ones that get thrown away. I know which inspectors get promoted and which ones get transferred to different departments." Elena wasn't the first person to report safety problems in Tunnel 7. She was just the first one brave enough to keep fighting when her reports were ignored. Maria's voice grew stronger as she continued. "We have a choice in this town. We can protect the company that puts our families in danger, or we can protect the people who are willing to speak up for our safety. I know which side I'm on." One by one, other residents stood up to share their stories. Pete Williams talked about his son who worked in the tunnels and came home every night covered in dust and fear. Annie Rodriguez described watching her daughter Anna organize college students to support worker safety reforms. Even some current miners, despite fears of retaliation, spoke about working conditions they had never dared to discuss publicly. By the end of the meeting, the community had split into two clear camps. On one side were those who wanted to maintain the status quo, protect the company, and keep the economic arrangement that had sustained BlackRock for decades. On the other side were those who believed that no job was worth dying for, and that speaking truth about dangerous conditions was a moral obligation. The television coverage of the town hall meeting was broadcast across the region. Federal investigators, who had been dragging their feet on Elena's initial complaints, suddenly announced a comprehensive investigation of Titan Mining's operations nationwide. The Mine Safety and Health Administration sent a team of inspectors to BlackRock within a week. They spent 3 days examining Tunnel 7 and emerged with grim faces and thick folders full of violations. On Friday afternoon, they ordered the immediate closure of the tunnel pending major structural repairs. Elena watched the announcement on the local news while sitting in her living room with Sophie. Seeing the yellow caution tape blocking the entrance to Tunnel 7 felt like a victory, but also like a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. "Mom," Sophie said, "are you glad you did all this, even though it's been so hard?" Elena thought about the question carefully. She had lost her job, faced legal threats, and endured weeks of financial stress and community criticism. But she also knew that 23 miners would go home safely every night instead of risking their lives in a tunnel that could collapse at any moment. "Yes, sweetheart," Elena said. "Sometimes doing the right thing is expensive, but not doing the right thing costs even more." The next morning, Elena received an email that made her smile for the first time in weeks. It was from a mine worker in West Virginia who had seen her story and Dr. Kim's research presentation. "Miss Kovach," the email read, "I work in a coal mine that has some of the same problems you documented in Montana. For months, I've been afraid to report what I see because I need this job to support my family. But watching your courage has shown me that staying silent isn't protecting anyone. I'm going to speak up because someone has to take the first step. Thank you for showing us that even when we're afraid, we don't have to be silent." Elena realized that her first step forward had become an invitation for others across the country to take their own first steps. The ripples were spreading far beyond BlackRock, reaching people she would never meet but who faced the same choice between silence and courage that she had faced in that dangerous tunnel. 6 months after Elena first discovered the cracks in Tunnel 7, she stood in a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., her hand raised as she swore to tell the truth. The room was packed with reporters, labor advocates, mining executives, and families of workers who had been killed or injured in preventable accidents. The federal investigation had confirmed everything Elena had documented, and more. Tunnel 7's structural problems were so severe that engineers estimated it could have collapsed completely within days of Carlos and Diego's accident. The investigation also revealed that Titan Mining had known about safety problems at multiple facilities for years, but had chosen to hide them rather than pay for proper repairs. Congressman Robert Hayes, chairman of the Labor and Workplace Safety Committee, leaned forward as Elena took her seat at the witness table. Miss Kovach, you've been through quite an ordeal for doing what most people would consider the right thing. Can you tell us what motivated you to keep fighting even when you faced job loss, legal threats, and community pressure? Elena looked out at the audience and saw Maria Santos sitting in the front row, Carlos beside her in his wheelchair. Ana Rodriguez was there too, representing the college students who had helped spread Elena's story across social media. Dr. Kim sat with other safety experts who had provided scientific backing for Elena's claims. Congressman Hayes, Elena began, I became a safety inspector because I wanted to protect the people I grew up with. These aren't just workers to me, they're my neighbors, my friends, people whose children go to school with my daughter. When I saw those cracks in Tunnel 7, I knew that staying silent would make me responsible for whatever happened next. Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. I tried to work within the system first. I filed reports, attended meetings, followed all the proper procedures. But I learned that some systems are designed to protect profits instead of people. When that happens, ordinary citizens have to step forward and demand better. The hearing lasted 3 days. Corporate executives testified that they had followed all applicable regulations and that Elena's concerns had been properly evaluated. But when confronted with photographs, engineering reports, and testimony from injured workers, their carefully prepared statements fell apart. The most powerful moment came when Diego Rodriguez, Carlos's nephew who had been trapped in the tunnel, testified about what he experienced during those 6 hours underground. I kept thinking about my family, Diego said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wondered if my mom would ever know what really happened to me, or if the company would just say it was an accident that couldn't have been prevented. When Elena spoke up about the safety problems, she gave a voice to all of us who were too scared to speak for ourselves. The Congressional Committee's final report resulted in the largest fines in mining industry history. Titan Mining was ordered to pay $37 million in penalties and to implement comprehensive safety upgrades at all their facilities. More importantly, the committee recommended new federal laws to protect workers who report safety violations from retaliation by their employers. But Elena's personal journey was far from over. Despite winning the legal battle, she still needed to rebuild her life. The Workers' Justice Coalition helped her find work as a safety consultant, traveling to mines across the region to conduct independent inspections and train workers on their rights. The job paid well, but it meant time away from home and constant reminders of the dangers that workers faced every day. Elena discovered that BlackRock's problems were not unique. Across the country, workers in mines, factories, and construction sites faced similar pressures to stay quiet about unsafe conditions. Elena's story had inspired others to speak up. But each case required the same difficult choice between personal security and moral courage. She received letters and emails from workers who had reported safety violations only to face job loss, legal threats, and community backlash. One letter particularly touched her heart. It came from Tom Bradley, a construction worker in Ohio whose company was building bridges with substandard materials. Tom had reported the problems to state authorities after seeing Elena's congressional testimony, but his union had pressured him to withdraw his complaint to protect jobs. Miss Kovach, Tom wrote, I know I'm doing the right thing, but it's hard to keep fighting when everyone around you just wants the problems to go away. How do you find the strength to keep going when you feel so alone? Elena called Tom that evening and spent an hour talking about the loneliness that comes with standing up for unpopular truths. She shared what she had learned about building networks of support and finding allies in unexpected places. Back in BlackRock, the town was slowly changing. Tunnel 7 had been closed for major reconstruction, which meant temporary job losses but also genuine safety improvements. The federal investigation had brought national attention to the community, attracting new businesses interested in the skilled workforce and the town's commitment to worker safety. Mayor Chen had been replaced in the next election by Annie Rodriguez, Anna's mother, who ran on a platform of economic diversification and transparent governance. The new administration actively recruited clean energy companies and small manufacturers who valued BlackRock's demonstrated commitment to worker protection. Elena attended the dedication ceremony for the Carlos Mendoza Worker Safety Center, AIA, new training facility funded by federal grants and corporate settlement money. The center would teach safety procedures to workers across the region and provide resources for people who needed to report dangerous conditions. Carlos, walking slowly but steadily without his wheelchair, cut the ribbon while Maria and their children watched proudly. Elena stood with Dr. Kim, Linda Torres, and dozens of workers and families who had been part of the long fight for justice. This center represents more than just safety training, Carlos said to the assembled crowd. It represents the idea that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. Elena looked around at the faces in the crowd. Some she recognized from years of living in BlackRock. Others she had met through the national movement for worker safety. She thought about Sophie, now 13 and proud to tell her classmates about her mother's courage. During the reception after the ceremony, Elena received another letter that would change her perspective on everything that had happened. It was from a young mining engineer named Jessica Liu, who had just graduated from college. Dear Miss Kovacs, the letter read, I learned about your story in my senior seminar on engineering ethics. Your example inspired me to choose a career in mine, safety instead of the more lucrative positions I was offered by mining companies. I want to be the kind of engineer who listens to safety inspectors like you instead of ignoring their warnings. Thank you for showing my generation that engineering isn't just about technical skills, it's about moral courage. Elena realized that her first step forward had created changes she never could have anticipated. Young professionals were choosing careers in safety and worker protection. New laws protected whistleblowers. Companies faced real consequences for putting profits ahead of people's lives, but perhaps most importantly, workers across the country now knew they weren't alone when they faced the choice between silence and speaking up for safety. Elena's story had started with one woman discovering dangerous cracks in a tunnel wall. It had grown into a national conversation about corporate responsibility, worker rights, and the courage required to speak truth to power. That evening, Elena sat on her front porch with her father Mikhail, watching the sunset over the mountains. His breathing was still labored, but his eyes were bright with pride. You know what I learned from all this, Papa? Elena said. Respecting the mountain means more than following safety rules. It means having the courage to speak up when you see danger, even when it's easier to stay quiet. Mikhail nodded slowly. The mountain teaches many lessons, but the most important one is this. Silence in the face of danger is not respect. It's betrayal of everyone who depends on you to keep them safe. Elena's phone buzzed with another message from a worker somewhere in America who had decided to step forward and report unsafe conditions. She smiled as she read it, knowing that her first step had become part of a much larger journey toward a world where no one had to choose between their job and their life.